I'm Tobias Revel.
And I'm Radha Mystery.
And this is Futur-ish, a podcast about how nothing is new and everything has happened before.
We've been working and playing in futures for over a decade of hype and bluster amidst increasing uncertainty and complexity.
In each episode, we explore a recent event or signal for its historical context and speculate on future possibilities.
And make it make sense for people like you and me.
We've been in a room for days now, but it's actually been really nice because I never get to see Bree and Charlie in real life. They're sick of me.
We have so many in-jokes that you're not a part of anymore, Tobias. So,
well, I was thinking some of our listeners I know are people who are maybe young folks who are interested in getting into futures and foresight, which is one of the things that we thought would be interesting about getting this estimable group together for, because we've got somewhat different career paths and perspectives that might be interesting to reflect on. But I think it's important to note that if you are thinking about a career in foresight, what you've got assembled here really is, the collective leadership of a global foresight firm, three of whom have spent the week in Los Angeles hanging out together, one of whom spent the week in a small room in Manchester learning about statistical analysis of capability intervals.
Tobias?
So my only advice to any budding foresighter is that it's a real roll of the dice.
Variety is the spice of life.
You've got to be open to a meandering path. Well, first of all, thank you guys. Thank you both, Bree, Charlie, for making the time, because I know it's been super chaos. We're super excited to be joined by two of our esteemed colleagues, Bree Trevena and Charlie Warwick, who are at the helm of our foresight team. And I'm wondering if maybe you guys want to do quick intros, who you are, why you're here.
Charlie, take the floor.
I was going to suggest alphabetical order, which would put you first. But no, I am happy to go first. It's very cool to be here, having been lurking and listening from the edges for some time, occasionally playing your own thoughts and insights back to you in our work context. So no, thanks. This is cool. Very cool indeed. So I've been I guess I'm a career foresighter, starting as a humble baby analyst in a very small firm, a small agency, doing strategy, but specifically longer term futures and foresight work. So I really cut my teeth there. And then I did a little stint in the UK Government Office for Science, working on building futures and foresight capability across all the departments there, but also working on advisory projects relating to specific policy areas or cross-cutting issues that might affect the United Kingdom as a nation. And from there jumped into this role with all you lovely folk, and I've been kicking around there for 3 years, really learning on a steep learning curve about the future of place and space and the built and natural environment. So I'm excited to be where I am and doing it with you guys.
Thank you, Charlie. And a true delight to be on the podcast and to be with you folks today. My name is Bree Trevena, and I had quite a different career path to you, Charlie. Yours kind of has this beautiful, clear line, and I suspect, like many people who work in futures and foresight, mine is much more of the kind of red string connecting a whole lot of different dots together. So I did start out exploring futures and foresight in university, and then thought, this probably won't lead to a career. I'll do something sensible and go into the arts. So I then worked in the arts sector and then arts policy for a long time in Melbourne, Australia. And working in that space, got really interested in the built environment and infrastructure and the ways that these scaffolded creative experiences, social experiences, and how we think about and understand different versions of the future, and how things like policy are actually incredibly fundamental in terms of designing and thinking about and creating types of futures that we then kind of bring into being. So I did that for quite a long time. And then I somehow in the middle there did a PhD in complex adaptive theory. And I came in actually really working on research programs. So thinking about kind of applied research. Spent some time working in advisory there while also doing some futures stuff, and then went back into government arts sector in Victoria, Australia for a little while, and then landed back here. So very different, much kind of swirlier career, but equally delighted to be with you all.
Because I haven't managed to do it for the last few recordings, rather, I did want to do some quick updates because we've had people have sent us stuff, and I think they're actually hoping we're going to mention it. So I'm like, I better get on with it.
Well, go on then.
So kill switches, a couple of episodes ago, we talked about the idea that the new Lockheed Martin F-35 had a kill switch built into it as an example of this idea of hyperstition, that the belief itself was almost more powerful than the reality. This year at the Munich Security Conference, there was reporting that Microsoft and Google executives were being highly pressured by European leaders to be clear on their ability to cut off access to their servers from the States. So that reared its ugly head. At the same time, UK banks have begun a process of setting in place backup plans if Visa and MasterCard are for some reason restricted in the US. So that idea of like the US government having this power, as we've seen recently with the announcement about Anthropic, indeed, being able to remove access to these technical systems on which we rely, and these major actors starting to take action on it. And then the bikes episode, or the anti-car episode more accurately, attracted a fair amount of commentary, most of it supportive, which I felt very vindicated by. Yeah, but an old friend of mine, Monique, sent over some stats from the Netherlands, actually. And importantly, in 2024, 675 people died in car accidents, of whom 246 were cyclists. But 70% of those 246 had no car involved. In other words, there were 172 people who were killed on bicycles alone. And this has been spiked recently by the surge in e-bikes. So actually, e-bikes are introducing elements of a lack of safety back into cities. And then finally, someone shared in a comment an amazing article, which I'll put in the comments of this episode, from the V&A's exhibition on cars in 2020. And it's an article called "There Are No Cars in Wakanda," about the fact that very often when you look at utopian visions, they do in fact lack cars. And visions of autonomous cars tend to focus in dystopias as iconic of social seclusion and class hierarchies and things like that. Please do keep sending in these little trinkets because they're really useful.
One last one that I will share about during our cyborg episode, where I went on a rant about how everything does not need to be a wearable, is a project by...
I think it was an evidence-led thesis.
is a project by Connor Eastwood called the Plurality Player. It's a portable two-way communication device. Looks about the size of one of the earlier iPods. Two-way communication device for humans and nature, translating stress, nutrient signals. Kind of the same thing as the insects wearable that we had talked about, but it's a little thing you hold. It has a piece that comes out of it that you would, put onto a tree or an element out in nature. And it's meant to serve as an interface, still providing that haptic feedback, giving you that data about the environment around you, but not a wearable. So it can be done differently.
Ecological walkie-talkie.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
So
we co-authored this article for the Dubai Future Forum. For those that don't know, the Dubai Future Forum is a relatively recent event in the calendar, bringing together the world's futurists. But we wanted to talk about this idea of what good looks like, which is obviously very subjective interpretation. And I think it's something that certainly, for me, Radha and I will often reflect on the fact that we have worked together for 15 years odd. And over that time, my sense of what good looks like has changed a lot. And especially with what I think is this paradigm shift we're all looking at in regenerative design and the sort of underlying principles there. But I think it'd be useful to start thinking about maybe where you were in your careers when you kicked off, coming from the arts or from government, like how you internally and reflexively coalesced around the idea of what good futures work might look like.
Gosh, making me reflect on my entry into this is interesting always, because like a lot of early entrance to the workforce, I was full of purpose-driven passion and some degree of naivety, and loved the idea of creating utopian visions with other smart people around a table. But yeah, my practice, I guess, had to move on pretty quickly as you realize that, well, I guess inherently futures, plural, need to be a range of the possible, and therefore you must approach that with some degree of neutrality and objectivity. And that's one of the things that we cover in the article itself is a good futurist a neutral futurist? We could debate amongst the four of us if that's ever actually possible as humans with all of our baked-in assumptions and biases, but there does have to be a certain amount of neutrality and suspension of value judgment I always talk about before we start describing any kind of future, because I think we say in the article as well, one person's utopia is another's dystopia. Wherever there is a good outcome, there's a less shiny one for someone else. And so the acknowledgement of that, I think, that came quite early on in my futures career, and I thought, oh God, how do I check this in myself? Who and what do I need around me to keep me as neutral as I possibly could be?
We had a feisty discussion about this in the comments. It's really fascinating writing an article with people that you work with and talk with and kind of build these projects with all together. But this article for me really just felt like us having a chat in the comments. as we were kind of annotating each other, saying, but what about, but what about, but what about? And to some extent, I think
Or,
the
to be
question
clear,
of,
annotating the wrong document for a good week or two.
Let's
least a
give
week.
the listeners a little bit of context here. I messed around with a little bit of a co-pilot experiment. Like, could our little AI intern Gary write this article better than we could? So I created the co-pilot version, which Tobias absolutely chewed through and spat out. But
Of course he
I then
did.
had to remind him that I actually just did that as an experiment, and there's a completely human-authored version sitting just here.
And I looked at it and thought, that's all right, Tobias will get stuck into this. I'm going to go and do something else. You're sort of my Tobias spot. I just sort of let it go, and it did resolve itself over time.
But I was going to ask, like, have you guys in your careers found yourselves in situations where you've really had to actively set aside your own implicit biases, and you've had to say, perhaps instinctually, this maybe rubs me the wrong way, but my role here is to be mediator and facilitator? Like, has that shown up in your careers at all?
I think to some extent it shows up in most jobs that you do, right? And ideally that you are not in a room full of people who furiously agree with you, which by its nature then means that you are likely to get something more generative, more productive, and you're able to take more of a critical eye to it. But yeah, I think in every discussion, it's a continual kind of checking of where you are, and that idea of, am I ever neutral? Perhaps not, but recognizing that these come from a particular place and understanding that sometimes in this role you are facilitating that conversation, and part of your job is to help elevate those different voices, different approaches, and think about how do they knit and weave together. But sometimes your role is also to put forward a specific position, and within that you need to be able to kind of be clear, be defensible about what sits behind that, and acknowledge that, you've chosen a corner.
But this even goes back to a discussion about like tools and methodology, doesn't it? Because one of the things that I found in some of the work that we've done, and even in when I'm kind of teaching with students over here, is they're not all coming from North America, or even kind of maybe like a more, what's the PC way to say Western these days? But
So-called
like,
developed world.
that's not PC over here, my friend.
I know.
Is it not?
As soon as you put those quotation marks verbally in there, Tobias, you've lost.
You can't do it. No, can't do that, Tobias.
Got many friends who are developed world.
Are you talking about me in the Antipodes?
This is going so well, you guys. No, but we have this with even just like when it comes to like constructs of time. Amongst my like cohort of students, oftentimes one of the first things we talk about is these different approaches that we have to things we take for granted, like time. And so much of the tooling and methodology around foresight and futurist practice assumes that there is past, present, future, that it is linear, right? That there's beginning, middle, and end. And if you go to cultures in other parts of the world, like in India, time is circular. And the language itself helps to demonstrate that. The way we conceive of time is based in a lunar calendar and things like that. So when you talk about past and present and future, sometimes past and future can be the same thing. And when you ask somebody to unfurl that way of thinking to more of a linear sensibility, it actually becomes quite challenging.
Yeah, some South American early careers folks in engineering and construction I was working with at the end of last year described, I think, the Colombian positioning of time as something that comes, the future as something that comes from behind you. You can't see it, you can't know it. We always visualize the future as something that is ahead, coming towards, the way we read from left to right.
There's something similar that we experience with Pacifica and First Nations futurists and communities who operate in that space, particularly when we are often talking in a built environment framework. We're talking in business case cycles, right? And the cycle of how long it takes to build something. And the ability for us to then start to layer that in our practice on top of these much kind of more expansive understandings of time, including what is longevity, what is long-term. What is long-term in a political cycle might be 3 years, but what is long-term in a community sense might be heading out to 100 years or more. So the ability to bring those two things together is kind of one of the challenges, but also one of the reasons that this is a fun place to work, right? Like, it's that kind of continual expansion and opening up of kind of time and space.
And to connect those ideas of time and neutrality that we were just talking about, it's very hard to remain neutral in our current context, in the current political climate, in the current narrativization of everything that's playing out in the world and the way it is. Taking a longer view of time helps you to some degree with neutrality, because we can see turbulence in our environment as a symptom of systems transition, and we can start to imagine like radical redistribution of wealth, radical new value structures.
There's something we've talked about before here. The idea that foresight is an industrial practice that emerges out of the Second World War because of the technological advances enabled by things like jets and computers that then go into industrial planning, strategy. Military people end up coming up with roadmaps, blah, 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 blah. The epitome of that thinking is sort of Pollack's Image of the Future, where he talks about this idea that our association of betterness is now in the future. So where once it was social change, where once it was even eschatological, so the afterlife, it is now in the future. And there's a sense that I have from going back to that initial question of what does good look like, the thing I've noticed over the last 10, 15 years is that association between the better and the future is being decoupled more and more and more. My follow-on question then is like, what sort of rhetorical role does futures and foresight play if it's not literally about the instantiation of futures and foresight?
This might not directly answer your question, but there's two really interesting things.
It would be
in
a
that.
first
One
if it
is...
did, Bree, wouldn't it? Imagine that.
Start every conversation with
I'm
Tobias.
going to take this conversation in the direction I wanted to go into, actually.
I think what you're talking about there is also this sense of nostalgia, and survey after survey that people either believe and have material reason to think that what happens for the next generation or for their current generation will not be whatever these markers of progress we have. But again, if we take this back to a very long time version, over these long-term timescales as well, this idea of the future or what is better in inverted commas being out in front is not always out in front over those longer scales. But there is this kind of deep sense of nostalgia at the moment, acknowledging that, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago was certainly not better for everybody within that space.
On the rhetorical use of foresight now, because I am lawful good according to the Dungeons and Dragons matrix, so I will answer your question in the way that you intended it to be answered.
Wait.
That wasn't even me.
But you did create the matrix.
I'm leaning into my trope.
Charlie, how did you know? Every episode,
Good. You dubbed him in
because I've been lurking.
She's been lurking,
Tobias. My psyche. So this is probably a bit trite, and you've all heard this a million times. But futures as being as real as histories, right? When it comes to storytelling, when it comes to being artifacts that are real, felt, used. In the article, we talk a bit about a responsible futurist, noting that once you've generated a future, once that seed of an imaginary is in someone's head, it can be used and it will inform decision making and it will inform conversations had with people. And that's just as real as, well, what you were saying, Tobias, about, the instantiation of any of those visions eventually. You can't actually disentangle one from the other. So being very conscious that whilst you think, okay, I'm a neutral facilitator, convener, I'll lead people through this participatory process, excellent. But the seeds that are created and planted there can grow and sprout in all sorts of different directions.
It reminds me, there's a paper by Nordman called Mind the Gap Revisited, which was about the controversies around nanotechnology in the 1990s, early 2000s, and pointing out that the invented ethical dilemmas of nanotechnology did more for nanotechnology than any actual technological advance in terms of putting it in the public, attracting investor interest, attracting news and journalism. And recent scholars have been arguing the same about AI.
This did come up at the Dubai Futures Forum. We did a session on this that I was a part of. And one of the questions was, as someone who practices foresight and futures, is that a mindset? Is it a profession or is it a responsibility? And it was fascinating to hear what came out of the stage, but I'm keen to know what you folks think.
Anyone can be a futurist. That's definitely bandied about. At what point do you cross this threshold of critical thinking ability that suddenly makes you a futurist? Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's cool that it is recognized as a profession, but I also think it's sometimes a bit damaging or limiting. And there are some fantastic debates raging, like Roberto Poli and that kind of school of quite academic futurists who are constantly debating, should futures, foresight, futurism, whatever you want to call it, be recognized as a social science? Or is it always richer because it borrows from other social sciences, and it has done forever? I fear a little bit that with like a proliferation of foresight, futures, forecasting agencies, the responsibility question gets pushed to the margins or not even acknowledged.
This might be a hot take, but do you remember what happened to design when design thinking came out as a thing?
Do I ever?
And we had a chat about this with Nick Foster when he was on the podcast. And I'm starting to feel like that's happening to foresight. And while there are benefits to toolkits like design thinking because it did afford access to the language of design to a wider audience, however, what I also found it doing as a designer sitting in the design world was a diluting and a watering down of what design is, what it could be, the impact it could have. And I think we've had to spend so much time going against that a little bit and having to undo some of the damage. And I'm starting to see that in foresight practice or futurist practice, because I do think it's a responsibility. It's impacting how cities are built, how policies are created, how, infrastructures are designed. And I think that's massive.
I was also reflecting on Nick's thoughts as well about the lack of professionalism in futurism. I mean, that was his basic thrust, isn't it? That basically, like, there's no standard, and so you can just say anything on a stage and make it look whizzy, and people will pay you a lot of money. You could arguably say the same for design, but with design, you can immediately test the functionality of the thing you're proposing. You know, if you design an app that's going to solve everyone's problems and it doesn't, then the thesis is immediately tested. Whereas if you say in 20 years, everyone's going to have speedboats and Labubus, then there's no way of testing it. And so people can...
Labubu's always coming. I'm sorry.
Still
Do
not
you want
100%
one?
on what a Labubu is. That's part of the problem. One of a word we haven't mentioned, which is often associated and bundled in, is futurology, which properly is the study of futures. And actually, I think more fields would benefit from that than they would from foresight, because if you can start to understand how futures are made and promulgated and why we have the ones we have, that can be in fact more useful than just trying to make your own new future, which is sort of foresight and futurism. The aspect of working in the future is largely incidental because the project is about challenging assumptions and biases and givens about the present. And the future was a useful way to do that, to say we can't really understand how things are thus without understanding how they could be different, and a really good way to suspend disbelief is going into the future, because again, you can't prove it.
This is where that debate, that poly debate I mentioned, rages, though. Is futurology actually just more useful in understanding our ecologies and societies and economies when it is like futurology plus another field? Fascinating to think about archaeology plus futurology. How did ancient civilizations think about futures? And what does that cause us to understand about the way that we construct them and use them? Neuroscience or cognitive studies plus futurology. Like, okay, really interesting then how our brains process information about the future. We store it in the same place that we store memories. So I agree with you, Tobias, that like futurology could be really helpful and it could elevate and professionalize what it is that we are doing. Is it then most useful when it's like futurology plus?
Well, we use mythology in the same way. We use mythology as a way of explaining the this-thusness of our present day, whether it's Judeo-Christian mythology or folk tales. The futures are effectively the same thing. They are insubstantial at the point of their creation. And so the knowledge of how that's done and why particular ones hold and why others don't is almost more useful than, again, creating wholesale ones that suit your particular purposes.
I remember a very foundational university course, which is a long time ago now, but it was called It's Always the End of the World. And it was very much looking at this. So it went through from sort of Zoroastrianism to, at the time, looking at different media artifacts and narratives that were circulated around, talking about what the end of the world was. And, in the 50s, alien invasions, these kinds of things, again, it's banal for us to say, but always echoing concerns of the present and what that might mean. And this always foreclosing and yet stalling what that end of the world might look like. So how do we start to utilize those futures in some of the more negative ways as well, in terms of how can they be used to either coerce people into certain beliefs or encourage people into those spaces? What's the risk in that? But also, where do we see the opposite happening in some of our kind of media artifacts and narratives around creating these ideas of what could a possible positive future look like, and who is that for?
And I think that to extend that idea as well, something I am concerned about or considering in the longer term is actually the bifurcation of our species, and how when we talk about our futures, how long are we actually going to be able to say we and really mean the whole of the species as we define it today? It means something for futures where we talk about we use the word we so much.
Yeah.
But couldn't you argue that that's already happening? Like, there is such a siloing. We're seeing it more in digital spaces and in social media, but I feel like that pervades people's value systems.
And it's a challenge to one of the descriptors we use in that article about a good futurist is the collective futurist. Can that be true? That's just highly context dependent, who you're working with, where you're working. Can futures only ever be done on small scales then?
To go back to that history, the practice we are still doing emerged as national projects in the 1950s, right? It was like French, Japanese, and American ex-military strategists. It was about like building a national economy around these new technologies and projecting them into the future, and a version of better that was associated with that. I've tried to push this idea on you before, Rada, of like the return of mercantilism, that actually we are returning somewhat to a mercantilist idea where, you know, the springtime of the nations is over. It had a good 180-year run, and now we're re-entering the world of mercantilism that dominated most of the European colonial expansion for 300-400 years, in which case we as a vanishingly small group of largely men who control all the wealth and the shipping lanes and everything else and are able to dictate what they think the future should be.
Rod, I have a question for you on this. Do you think there's ever been a capitalized idea of we, right? Like there's these kind of moments that you see in time, like we see the Earth from space and it's a little blue dot, and there's this concept of universal consciousness, etc. But do you think that there has been, even at a national level, a we in those ways?
I think it might have been written like that in fiction and history books. But like, even if you think about how histories have been recorded and revised, there is not a singular point of view. And I think, you know, a lot of our work does end up in narratives, and, you know, it does allow for a bit of artistic license. If we think about how histories have been recalled and our memories of what the past is, I wonder who we include in our sense of we. And one of the things that I often talk about is when we talk about who we are designing for in these futures, who are left out of those visions, either intentionally or unintentionally. An example I use a lot is the breakdown of infrastructure in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, and the parts of the city that were more resilient to these, you know, Category 5 storms were in predominantly socioeconomically wealthier areas, right? So if you think about how the city evolved and how you know, the urban planning mechanism was established over time, it's just, to me, like, I don't think that folks were thinking about the we as this collective we of everyone who inhabits the city of New Orleans at that time.
It does heavy subjectifying work. The thing I've been studying a bit recently is how in AI policy, ideas like humanity and society are thrown around quite quickly as subjectifying measures that give like a vitality to the argument to take action, because it's like, you're part of that group, you're reading this, you're now complicit, you've got to do something about it.
So we're touching on the issue of the scale of the act of futuring, because the we that we do the futures with and for, it can only ever, it gets unmanageable and it gets inaccurate once we start getting too expansive. But also the scale of the futures that we are developing, generating, building out together. We keep coming back to this in our work all the time, the idea that grandiose sweeping statements about like novel economic norms can only go so far in terms of emotional resonance. And it's the cat food, and it's the nappies, and it's the length of your commute, and those things in the future that are really going to unlock any kind of meaningful change in perception or perspective. So the scale of the futures we develop is also a massive challenge.
It can be hard to find you in them. Like, where do I exist, and where does my commute exist, and where do I go buy, you know, a bagel from in this future? But equally, we're always dancing between those scales, right? Because a lot of what we are talking about is systems change. We talk about this in ecological shifts. We talk about this at kind of city scale and all of these things. So it's this continual movement back and forward between them in order to create this narrative and an understanding, and to be able to hold them in your head simultaneously, which we need to be able to do, to think about this as a systems change, but continuously bringing it back to this kind of micro meso level as well. So I think a lot of what we do in this practice is just dance across those scales pretty continuously and try and hold it all in your head at once, which is the challenge for us and for people that we work with.
Yeah, I think we've had quite a few conversations, the four of us, in different ways recently about why can't I just get AI to do your job? And I think that's what you just described, Bree. It's that thing of being able to transition quite seamlessly, at least intellectually, between these scales, and to extract from that, okay, so what for your commute, for where you buy your bagel? I wonder how much that particular understanding of futures is because that's the industry we work in. We're not in digital tech, we're not in product, we're not in fashion. We're in a business where projects can take years, if not decade plus, to get from an initial idea to something that's in the ground, and has to stay up for 150 years and operates over potentially thousands of square kilometers.
Yeah, and the material stuff, not that digital isn't material stuff as well, but the ability to point to something, kick something and say, well, it's got to do the same thing as that did, does make it easier perhaps to give a bit of a grounding. But then the challenge of that is, how do you start to layer the emotional systems, ecological systems and digital systems, wrap those in and around it at the same time, starts to get to be a lot for any one person, any one group or any one profession to hold. So that does come back to this question about where do you borrow, interact, engage with other professions who've also got some really advanced skills in being able to do this.
And do you think that leads to a difference in the way that futures are positioned? Because a thought that struck me there is that in, let's say, digital technology, future is associated with aspiration. You will be able to do this. You'll be more empowered to do this. Whereas generalizing somewhat, when we're doing futures work, it's more about risk. It's more about, resilience around climate change or social change or whatever it is.
In shock news, I'm going to disagree with you a bit there, Tobias, in that I think...
Sorry, I'll cut this.
Still can't see the shocked look on your face. But I think the city building project, you talk about these systems that we operate in the built environments, which interlock to create cities, right? And anytime you are creating a master plan or an architectural rendering, you are creating this really quite comprehensive view of an aspirational city. And rarely are people doing master plans because they want to keep things stable. They're generally doing because they want to make it better in whatever's term for your citizenry, for your economy, ideally for your much broader citizenry that also includes ecological citizens within that space. But I think there is absolutely something that is still aspirational in this. And sometimes we can hide that behind the fact that it's a HVAC system. But even so, there is still a driver in that people have better air quality, or it's more efficient, or it's more effective. So I think there is always something aspirational in it. It just may not be quite as overt, is that it often feels like from the digital realm that it is a kind of clear straight shot to a particular type of future that closes off rather than affords a whole lot of more open spaces. And I suspect the city projects, particularly given that we work in places like Singapore, we are working in Perth, we are working in Los Angeles, we are working in all of these different places. There's a different range of what aspirational might look like, but I think it is still there.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in our particular flavor of futures that we do in the built environment, I think we're good at helping our colleagues, these phenomenal designers, engineers, etc., reconsider their work as containers for emergence. And I liked what you were saying, Bree, about, these open spaces where other things can then happen. And we don't have to describe exactly what those things are. And I know that runs kind of counterintuitive to, futures is describing different ways that things could be. But acknowledging that places and spaces, the physicality of that, are just containers for emergence when we in sort of life terms.
Yeah.
And maybe that is something that is missing from the digital design discourse.
Charlie, you did work on a project where you tried to make HVAC aspirational. So
I did.
Oh, wait, what?
This can go in the show notes. This is open access. Yeah. There's a phenomenal organization out there called the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers who, they do all sorts of industry guidance and technical documentation around things like HVAC. But if we think about what they're ultimately all about, which is the performance of our buildings, and we apply a futures lens to that, what does high performance look like in the built environment in 2050 beyond? The only way into that, when we were engaging with that work, was a playful route. You can't use the starting point of HVAC systems and public health water waste disposal systems. You have to take a starting point of, the context, obviously, the things that are changing for the whole built environment, the kinds of needs and expectations that creates for buildings. And importantly, back to this notion of that's not just the top of mind expectations and challenges that occur for us as humans and users of buildings and investors and owners of buildings, species that have to kind of live and navigate around these buildings. And from there, we could do some slightly more fun, playful and provocative work around what speculative features and facets might exist in these buildings to meet those needs and expectations. So anything from, using the natural topography of a place to flush water through or under a building rather than pumping it, which is energy intensive, through to tailoring microenvironments in buildings rather than having the ambient space be just one thing for all people who move through it? Might you measure the performance of a building based on how many friendships or marriages or relationships come from people being in that space? We were able then to unlock and explore a whole wide range of new performance metrics with folks who, are engaging in this world, and they're professionals in mechanical, electrical engineering, public health engineering, etc., but haven't yet been able to use futures to meaningfully change their design work or the approach to their work.
I'm aware we're running up against time, and every second we talk is an extra 3 seconds of me having to edit.
Got it.
But given that, as what I said at the beginning, that I think a lot of folks who listen to this getting into the futures world and into the world of foresight, and we've got a good few decades under our belt collectively, I'd be interested, and Rada and I talk about this stuff enough, but I'd be interested from your perspective, like, what do you think the next few years looks like for this practice?
So I think there's a bit of navigation to be done for people in this field in the coming years. There's always been a challenge of navigating forecasting versus futuring and those different terminologies and approaches. I think new forms of AI are creating new offerings and methods and approaches out there in the market that are going to force us to think about that even more carefully. And I think the challenge of the speculative futurist will be to dodge probabilistic forms of futuring, or find ways to work with them and complement them with a little bit of what I would call red team thinking, or really deliberately draw in divergent opinions, adjacencies, entertain the opposite in your thinking in a way that probabilistic large language models never could. There's got to be some kind of way of working with this that gets established and experimented with in the coming years.
And to bring us back to the article that we co-authored together, a bit of a spoiler so people don't actually have to read the article, but do read the article. Where we came to in this is, should we, rather than try and be good at the profession, should we try and be useful? So we talked about this in terms of what is being useful and what is being heard in this space. And we, from that, had linked back to a Singaporean futurist and artist, Juvan Chandra, who himself was evoking a dance scholar, Heli Minati, when talking about this idea of being both an invested traveller and a critical friend, a companion and a provocateur. So how do you find the space that enables you to still be heard and be engaged by being close enough on the ground with how people are experiencing the world and their lived reality on a daily basis without running too far ahead, while still helping people to be pointing in that direction and eyes up over the horizon? It's a bit like, trying to tie your shoelaces while looking at the horizon, right? Like these are challenging things to do. But I think for people in this profession at the moment, it is thinking quite deeply about what is useful here. And how can we make sure that you are sort of walking out in front of someone but holding their hand at the same time, rather than running in such a pace that it's no longer a conversation.
It's so nice that we didn't have to just hear our two voices this whole entire time. So Bree and Charlie, absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us.
I want to know what your listeners think good futures or good futurists are. There's one for the question for the crowd.
Thank you so much, both. Thank you for doing
you.
this. Yeah, it's been long overdue and yeah, really good conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks,
For
folks.
boobies, lawful good, all of those things.